He had given this company 11 years of his life. 11 years of early mornings, missed weekends, and swallowed pride. And in less than 4 minutes, the most powerful woman in the building looked him dead in the eye and told him that men like him never leave, because men like him can't afford to. The whole room was watching. Every executive, every VP, every yes person who had ever nodded along while the warnings piled up. They were all waiting to see what Rafe Calder would do next. He reached down, picked up an empty cardboard box, and started packing. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end, because this one is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Alden Moore Group occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower on the west side of the city, and from the outside it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. A thriving, successful company with clean windows and a polished lobby, and a receptionist who smiled at everyone who walked through the door like she meant it. Rafe Calder had never worked in a glass tower before he came here. He'd spent his 20s doing maintenance work for a mid-sized property management outfit in Ohio, which meant he knew how to fix things quietly and efficiently and without anyone ever saying thank you. That was fine. He didn't need thank you. He needed the work to be done right, and most of the time it was, because he made sure of it. He joined Alden Moore 11 years ago as a junior facilities coordinator. The title sounded more important than the job actually was. Mostly, he was scheduling HVAC inspections and chasing down contractors who hadn't showed up when they said they would. But he was good at it. Organized. Detail-oriented in a way that his supervisors appreciated without ever quite acknowledging out loud. Within 3 years, he was managing a team. Within 6, he was running the entire facilities division for 3 of the company's 5 domestic sites. Facilities supervisor. It was one of those titles that people at cocktail parties didn't quite know what to do with. It didn't carry the weight of director or VP, and it didn't come with the kind of compensation that made people nod with respect. What it came with was responsibility, a very specific, very exhausting kind of responsibility that nobody at the executive level ever fully understood because they never had to. Rafe understood it, though. He understood it because it lived in his body. It was the tightness across his shoulders at 6 a.m. when he pulled into the parking garage and checked his phone to see what had broken overnight. It was the low-grade headache he carried most Thursdays because Thursday was when the week's problems had fully stacked up, but the weekend was still too far away to be any comfort. It was the way his jaw ached sometimes because he'd been clenching it without realizing, holding back things he wanted to say to people who had the authority to ignore him. He had a team of 19, maintenance technicians, contractors, logistics coordinators, a part-time safety compliance officer named Delia, who he'd fought to keep on the payroll for 3 budget cycles in a row. He knew their names. He knew which of them had kids in college, and which ones were dealing with sick parents, and which ones were carrying more than their job descriptions showed. That was not required of him. He just did it because it mattered. What didn't matter, apparently, was anything Rafe put in writing. The first memo went out in January 2 years ago. It was addressed to the director of operations, a man named Garrett Finch, who wore expensive watches and had a habit of sitting back in his chair with his arms crossed whenever someone presented him with a problem, as if the presentation itself were an inconvenience. The memo outlined 3 things: a structural concern with the ventilation systems in the Meridian building, one of Alden Moore's oldest facilities, a fire suppression panel that had been flagged during a routine check but never properly repaired, and a growing pattern of deferred maintenance across multiple sites that Rafe believed was approaching a threshold where it would stop being a budget strategy and start being a liability. Garrett's response came 2 days later via email. 4 lines. He appreciated the thoroughness. He would flag it for the next quarterly review. Facilities should continue normal operations in the meantime. Rafe sent a follow-up in March. Then again in June, after one of his technicians nearly got hurt when a section of suspended ceiling in the Meridian building gave way during a routine inspection. He sent photographs. He sent estimated repair costs. He sent a projected timeline for what would happen if repairs were delayed further. He got back a meeting invitation for a date 6 weeks out. The meeting was rescheduled twice and then quietly disappeared from the calendar entirely. He went to Finch's office in person in August. He stood at the doorway. Finch never invited him to sit down, and laid out the situation as plainly as he knew how. The ventilation system was not just aging, it was failing. The suppression panel had now been flagged in 2 separate inspections as non-compliant. If a third-party auditor came through, they would find it. "That's what we have legal for," Garrett said, not looking up from his laptop. "I'm not talking about legal exposure," Rafe said. "I'm talking about someone getting hurt." Garrett looked up then. He had very steady eyes, the kind that made you feel like you were the one being unreasonable. "Rafe, every facility manager in the country thinks their building is one bad day away from a disaster. That's the nature of the job. We assess risk, we prioritize, and we make decisions based on what the budget allows. That's how it works." "I know how it works." "Good." Garrett went back to his laptop. "Keep me updated." Rafe drove home that evening and sat in his car in his own driveway for almost 15 minutes before going inside. His wife, Camille, asked him how his day was, and he said fine, and she looked at him the way she always looked at him when he said fine, which was a look that meant she knew better but was choosing to give him space. He didn't tell her about the ventilation system. He didn't tell her about Garrett's eyes or the dismissal that had been wrapped in calm, professional language so expertly that he'd almost doubted himself on the drive home. He didn't want to say it out loud yet. Saying it out loud would make it more real, and real things had consequences. The audit came on a Tuesday morning in February, 14 months after that first memo. It was a state safety compliance review, mandatory for any company operating facilities above a certain occupancy threshold, and Aldenmore had known about it since October. Rafe had submitted a pre-audit readiness report in November that outlined, once again, the outstanding issues. He had flagged the Meridian building specifically. He had recommended in writing that certain systems be prioritized for repair before the audit window. Nothing happened. So when the auditors walked through the Meridian building on that Tuesday morning, they found exactly what Rafe had said they would find. The ventilation system had 3 documented deficiencies. The fire suppression panel was non-compliant with current code and had visible evidence of deferred maintenance. There were 2 other issues in secondary areas that had developed since his last report, because by now the backlog had grown into something Rafe's team simply didn't have the resources to address on their own. The audit report landed at corporate by Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, Rafe had been summoned to the 34th floor. He'd been up there maybe 4 times in 11 years. The carpet was thicker up there. The air smelled different, cooler somehow, more deliberate. The conference room they put him in had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the west side of the city, and the table was long enough that you could seat 20 people and still have room to feel alone. He sat down and waited. His phone buzzed twice. He ignored it. Mara Voss walked in 7 minutes later and the room changed when she did. That was the only way Rafe ever knew how to describe it. The room changed. She was 52, medium height, with silver hair she wore short and close to her head, and a way of moving through a space that suggested she had long ago stopped noticing whether people were watching her. She always dressed in dark colors. She had a face that was composed in a way that read as calm but probably wasn't, if you looked long enough. Behind her came Garrett Finch, which Rafe had expected. Then a woman from HR named Sylvia Crane, who Rafe had spoken to maybe twice in his career. Then 2 men he recognized as senior executives, but whose names he could never quite keep straight. One of them had a legal pad, the other had a tablet, and was already looking at it. Mara Voss sat down directly across from Rafe. She set a single folder on the table in front of her and put her hands flat on it, and for a moment she just looked at him. Not unkindly, just steadily. The way you look at something you're trying to figure out. "Mr. Calder," she said, "I've been briefed on the audit results." "Okay," Rafe said. "I'd like to understand what happened." He noticed she didn't say what went wrong or who dropped the ball. "I'd like to understand what happened." It was careful language from a careful person, and he respected it even though he also knew it was the kind of language that could be used to place blame very efficiently if it needed to be. "You can start wherever you'd like," she added. He started at the beginning. He laid it out in order. The January memo, the follow-up in March, the incident with the ceiling in June, the in-person conversation with Garrett in August, the pre-audit readiness report in November. He didn't editorialize. He didn't raise his voice. He'd had 2 years to think about how he would tell this story if he ever got the chance to tell it to the right person, and he decided a long time ago that the facts were going to have to carry it, because he couldn't afford to look like someone who was angry or defensive or trying to cover himself. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Garrett spoke first. Rafe, I think there's some important context missing here. I have the memos, Rafe said. He opened the folder he'd brought with him and slid printed copies across the table. Dated, time-stamped, with the delivery receipts. I have the email chains. I have the inspection reports. I have the documentation from every flagged issue going back 26 months. Garrett's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. The budget constraints we were operating under are in the memos, Rafe said. I requested additional resources 4 times. I outlined projected costs. I outlined projected liability. It's all in there. Sylvia Crane from HR had picked up the printed pages and was reading them. One of the executives had stopped looking at his tablet. Mara Voss had not moved. She was still looking at Rafe with that same flat, careful attention, and he couldn't tell what she was thinking, which bothered him more than he wanted to admit. She said, "Why didn't you escalate further, beyond Garrett?" "Because Garrett is the director of operations, and the chain of command exists for a reason. I followed it. I did what I was supposed to do." He paused. "I also didn't have any reason to believe going over his head would produce a different result." "That's a significant assumption," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It was." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked down at the folder in front of her, which was her own version. The audit report, probably, and whatever Garrett had sent up before this meeting. Rafe watched her read something and then set it aside and fold her hands. "Mr. Calder," she said, "companies like this one operate in complex environments. Budget cycles, competing priorities, regulatory pressures. The people at the top cannot always have perfect visibility into every operational concern that gets raised at every level. I understand that. What I'm trying to assess is whether there was a systemic failure or an individual one." Something in Rafe's chest tightened, because he knew what that sentence was doing. He knew which direction it was pointing. Systemic failures were complicated and expensive and hard to address in a quarterly earnings call. Individual failures were clean. Individual failures had names. "There's documentation," he said. "It's in front of you." "Documentation that you prepared?" "Yes." "And filed through a chain of command that, as you've acknowledged, did not result in action." "That's right." "So the question becomes," she said, "whether the documentation was sufficient, whether it was urgent enough in its framing, whether—" "With respect," Rafe said, and he heard his own voice come out quieter than he expected, steadier than he felt. "I have sent 17 documents over 26 months about systems that were failing and people who could have been hurt. I used the word urgent. I used the word liability. I used the word risk. I sent photographs of a ceiling that partially collapsed. I don't know what framing would have been sufficient, but if you're suggesting the problem was the way I communicated rather than the fact that nobody acted on it, then I think we're having a different conversation than I thought we were." The room was very quiet. Garrett said, with his arms crossed and his voice tight. "No one is suggesting—" "Rafe has given us quite a bit to review," Mara Voss said, and there was something in the way she said it that made Garrett stop talking. She looked at Rafe again. "I appreciate your candor. This is going to require some time to fully evaluate." "Of course," Rafe said. There was a pause. Then she said, and it was said almost gently, which somehow made it worse, "You've been with Alden Moore for 11 years, is that right?" 11 years in March. "Then you understand that the company's interests and the interests of the people who work here are not always separate things. Protecting the company, protecting its reputation, is also how we protect the jobs of the people who depend on it." She tilted her head slightly. "People like you, Rafe. You have a team, a salary, benefits. That kind of stability isn't something most people walk away from lightly." He heard what she was saying underneath what she was actually saying. He'd been hearing versions of it for 2 years, just never quite this directly, never from this high up. He looked at the folder in front of him. Then he looked at Garrett, who was watching him with his arms still crossed. Then he looked at Mara Voss, who was watching him with something that might have been patience or might have been calculation. He genuinely could not tell. He thought about Camille. He thought about their mortgage, which had 4 years left on it. He thought about his daughter, who was starting college in the fall. He thought about Delia, the compliance officer he'd fought to keep for 3 budget cycles, and the technician who'd been standing under a ceiling section when it gave way, and the look on that technician's face afterward. Not fear exactly, more like the look of someone who just understood something they'd already known but hadn't wanted to believe. He thought about 17 documents over 26 months. He looked under the conference table. There was a cardboard box there, Barb, a flat folded one, the kind that got left behind after supply deliveries and never quite made it to recycling. He reached down and picked it up and set it on the table and started to unfold it. Rafe, Sylvia from HR said. Her voice had gone a little uncertain. What are you doing? He didn't answer right away. He pressed the bottom flaps into place, squared the corners, and reached for the folder he'd brought with him, the one with all 26 months of documentation in it. He set it in the box. Mr. Calder, Mara Voss said. She wasn't leaning back anymore. Her hands had come off the table. I'm not a person who makes scenes, Rafe said, and his voice was still steady, which surprised him. I'm not going to say anything dramatic. I'm just going to go. Nobody is asking you to leave, she said. Nobody's asking me to stay either. He looked at her directly. Not in the way that counts. He put his phone and his pen into the box. He picked it up. He looked at the room one more time. At Garrett, whose expression had gone carefully blank. At the executives whose names he couldn't remember. At Sylvia from HR, who was looking at him with something that might have been distress. At Mara Voss, who was looking at him with something he couldn't name at all. I'll coordinate with Delia on the transition, he said. She knows the systems better than anyone. Then he walked to the conference room door, shifted the box under one arm, and opened it. The hallway outside was bright and quiet and smelled like carpet cleaner and recirculated air. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood there while he waited, with the box under his arm and his heart doing something loud and irregular in his chest that he was going to have to deal with eventually, but not right now. Right now, he just needed the elevator to come. It came. He got in. The doors closed. Somewhere above him, on the 34th floor, in a conference room with thick carpet and floor-to-ceiling windows, 11 years of his professional life had just ended in less than 90 seconds of silence. He looked at his reflection in the elevator doors, slightly warped, the way reflections always are in elevator doors. And he thought, okay, just that. Just okay. The elevator took him down. The elevator let him out in the lobby, and Rafe walked through it without stopping, without looking at the receptionist who always smiled at everyone like she meant it, without pausing at the security desk where a guard named Marcus had said good morning to him for 11 years. He walked straight through the glass doors and out into the cold air and kept walking until he reached the parking garage and found his car and stood next to it for a moment with the cardboard box balanced against his hip. His hands were shaking. He hadn't noticed that upstairs. He noticed it now. He put the box on the roof of the car and pressed both palms flat against the cold metal and breathed. The garage smelled like exhaust and concrete and the specific kind of damp that never fully dries in winter. And somewhere on a lower level, a car alarm was going off in short, irritated bursts. He stood there until his hands stopped shaking. It took longer than he expected. Then he put the box in the back seat, got in the car, and sat there for a while before starting the engine. He thought about calling Camille. He picked up his phone twice and put it down both times. He didn't know what to say yet. The words hadn't arranged themselves into anything that made sense to hand to another person. What had just happened was still too close to look at straight on. It had that quality that very large things sometimes have, where you can't see the shape of them until you've gotten some distance. He started the engine and drove. He didn't go home. He drove to the Meridian building instead, which was 20 minutes across town and which he hadn't visited since the audit team came through. He parked outside and sat there looking at it. A 6-story building from the 70s with a brick facade that had been painted over twice and windows that were original to the construction, which was part of the problem, had always been part of the problem. The seals were compromised, and that contributed to the humidity issues that fed the ventilation strain. He knew this building the way you know a person you've worked alongside for a long time. Not fondly exactly, but with a kind of detailed, involuntary familiarity. A woman from his team named Sandra was standing outside on a smoke break, and she saw him and did a visible double take. "Rafe, what are you doing here? I thought you had the executive meeting this morning." "I did," he said. She looked at his face. She'd worked with him for 6 years, and she was perceptive the way people get when they've spent a long time reading a workplace for signals. "How'd it go?" "I'm going to be transitioning out," he said. "Delia's going to need to be briefed." Sandra stared at him. She had a cigarette burning down between two fingers, and she'd forgotten about it. Transitioning out meaning, I resigned. You, Rafe? I know. They were trying to blame you. It wasn't a question. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because they didn't have to. Sandra had been on his team long enough to have read every memo he'd sent and watched every one of them disappear into the institutional silence of the 34th floor. I'm going to need you and Delia to make sure the transition is clean, he said. There are 3 open work orders on the suppression panel that need to stay visible. Don't let anyone bury them. They're going to try, she said. I know. Document everything. Keep copies. He paused. That's all I've got. She dropped the cigarette and stepped on it. Then she surprised him. She crossed her arms and looked away toward the street, and her jaw was tight in a way that meant she was working hard to keep her expression from doing something she didn't want it to do. This isn't right, she said, quieter. No, he agreed. It isn't. He drove home after that. He sat in his own driveway for 11 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock on the dashboard. And then he went inside. Camille was in the kitchen. She was a high school biology teacher, and it was a teacher workday, which meant she was at the kitchen table with her laptop and a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm and a stack of papers she was grading with a red pen. She looked up when he came in, and then she looked at the cardboard box he was carrying, and then she looked at his face. What happened? She said. He set the box on the counter. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table across from her. He put his hands flat on the table, which was something he'd apparently started doing today when he needed to feel something solid and real. I quit, he said. Camille put down her red pen. She didn't say anything right away, which was one of the things he'd always loved about her. She didn't rush into the space that opened up after difficult sentences. She let the sentence exist for a moment first. Tell me, she said. So he told her. All of it, from the beginning, which he'd never actually done. He'd given her pieces over the years, fragments, the edited version that didn't require her to worry too much, the version where he was managing the situation rather than losing to it. He told her about the memos and Garrett's steady eyes and the ceiling that fell and the pre-audit report that nobody acted on, and the meeting that morning, and Mara Voss, and the way she'd said people like you, and the way the room had felt when he'd picked up that box and started folding it. When he finished, Camille was quiet for a moment. Then she said, The cardboard box was already in the conference room? Under the table. Huh. She looked at him. That's kind of perfect. Yeah. He almost smiled. It was the first time anything had felt like it might lead to a smile since about 8:30 that morning. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Okay, she said. We're okay. We have savings. We have time. She squeezed his hand once, firmly, the way she did when she meant something and didn't want to oversell it. Are you okay? He thought about it honestly instead of answering reflexively. I don't know yet, he said. That's a good answer, she said. Back on the 34th floor, the conference room had not quite reassembled itself into normalcy after Rafe walked out of it. Mara Voss remained at the table for a moment after the door closed, her hands still flat in front of her, her eyes on the space where Rafe Calder had been sitting. The room held that particular kind of quiet that follows something unexpected. Not silence exactly, but a suspended quality, like everyone was waiting to take their first full breath. Garrett Finch broke it. Well, he said, in a tone that was working very hard to sound like this was manageable, that's going to create a transition issue, but I think we can… Sylvia, Mara said, without looking at Garrett. Sylvia Crane looked up from the printed pages she'd been reading. Yes? What's your read on that documentation? Sylvia was careful the way good HR people are careful. She understood that her answer right now was going to be read in multiple directions simultaneously. She set the pages down. It's thorough, she said. The dates are consistent with what I can pull from the system. The requests are… they're clearly documented. Clearly documented as having been ignored, said one of the executives whose name Rafe had never managed to keep straight. He was looking at his tablet with an expression that suggested he was already thinking about the audit report and what a plaintiff's attorney might do with the material Rafe had just slid across the table. Nobody ignored anything, Garrett said. We made prioritization decisions based on available resources. Garrett! Mara finally looked at him, and whatever was in that look made him stop. I'd like you to step out for now. A beat. Mara, I think it would be useful for me to. I'll have Sylvia follow up with you this afternoon. Her voice hadn't changed. It was still level, still composed. But something in the room had shifted, the same way something in the room had shifted when Rafe started folding that cardboard box. And Garrett felt it the same way everyone else felt it. He picked up his legal pad and left. After the door closed behind him, Mara looked at the documents on the table. Rafe's printed folder, the audit report, her own briefing materials. And then she looked at the window for a moment. The city was out there, doing what cities do on a Tuesday morning, indifferent to what was happening on the 34th floor of a glass tower on the west side. "Get me everything," she said. "Email logs, maintenance requests, budget allocation records for the facilities division going back 3 years. All of it." She stood up. "And find out who Delia is." Rafe spent the rest of that day doing the things you do when your professional life has just disassembled itself. He called his insurance provider to understand his COBRA options. He pulled up his bank statements and looked at them for longer than was probably useful. He took a walk around the neighborhood at 4 in the afternoon because he didn't know what else to do with his body. The walk helped, a little. He went past the elementary school where his daughter had gone, which was now just a building with a playground, past the dry cleaner where a man named Roy had been pressing his dress shirts for 9 years and always asked how things were going at work. He didn't stop today. He didn't feel like answering that question. His phone buzzed twice during the walk. Both times it was people from his team, Marcus first, then a technician named Chris, texting variations of the same thing. "Heard what happened? That's wrong. Let us know if you need anything." He read both messages and didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. The support was real, and it mattered, and he also felt the particular loneliness of having done something that couldn't be undone, and now having to live inside the consequences of it. He told himself for 2 years that if it ever came to this, he'd be at peace with it. He told himself that the documentation was enough, that he'd done what he was supposed to do, that his conscience was clean, and that had to count for something. All of that was still true. But the truth didn't make the fear go away, and standing on a sidewalk at 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in February with no job and a college tuition payment coming in the fall, the fear was real, and it didn't particularly care about his documentation. I went home and ate dinner with Camille, and they talked about other things, mostly because there were only so many times you could return to the same subject before the words started to lose their meaning. Camille told him about a student of hers who had been struggling all semester and had turned in, without warning, the best lab report she'd seen in 3 years of teaching. "Sometimes people just need the right conditions," she said, and he thought she probably meant more than the student. He went to bed at 10 and didn't sleep well. That was going to be a pattern for a while, and he knew it. The next morning, Garrett Finch arrived at his office at 8:15 to find that his access card no longer opened his door. He stood there for a moment in the hallway, trying the card twice more with the methodical disbelief of someone whose mind hasn't caught up to what's happening yet. Then his phone rang. It was Sylvia Crane. She asked him to come to HR at his earliest convenience, which was the language HR used when they meant right now. He was not fired that morning. That would take another week and several attorneys, and conversations happening at levels of the company that Garrett was no longer privy to. But his access to operational systems was suspended pending review, and Sylvia walked him through what that review would entail with a precision that made very clear that Mara Voss had spent the previous evening reading every email Rafe Calder had ever sent. Garrett sat across from Sylvia in her office, with his arms crossed, the same posture he'd had in the conference room the day before, the arms crossed thing that was supposed to convey authority, but increasingly just looked like a man holding himself together. And he said, "This is being mischaracterized." "I understand," Sylvia said. "The budget constraints were real. Every decision was made with the information and resources we had available." "I understand," Sylvia said again, in a tone that meant, "I understand that you believe that, and we will be conducting a thorough review to determine whether that's accurate." Garrett left Sylvia's office at 9:40 and took the elevator down to the lobby and stood outside for 10 minutes with his phone in his hand. He called his personal attorney at 9:51. The attorney listened and then said the thing attorneys say in these situations, which was that Garrett should not make any statements, should not send any emails, and should let counsel handle any further communication with the company. Garrett hung up and looked at the glass tower above him and thought about 11 years. Not his 11 years, but Rafe Calder's, because it kept occurring to him that they'd been there the same length of time. that they'd occupied the same building for over a decade and never once had a real conversation about anything that wasn't transactional. He thought about the ceiling that had partially collapsed in the Meridian building and the photograph Rafe had sent him, which he had looked at and then closed and not opened again because the looking at it made him feel a specific kind of discomfort that was easier to avoid than to address. He thought about Mara Voss's face in the conference room yesterday when she said, "I'd like you to step out for now." He went back inside and up to his suspended office and sat at his desk for a while, which was not technically allowed but which no one stopped him from doing, and he looked at his screensaver cycling through photographs, a beach vacation, a company event, his kids at Christmas, and he felt the specific weight of a person who has been telling themselves a story about their own behavior for long enough that the story had started to feel like the truth, and who is now being required to look at it from a different angle. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was, in fact, one of the worst feelings he'd had in a long time. He was not entirely sure what to do with it. Mara Voss did not sleep much that night either, though for different reasons. She had a ritual when the problems were serious. She would work until she couldn't think clearly anymore, and then she would stop and sit somewhere quiet, usually the window seat in her home office, and let her mind do what it needed to do without directing it. She'd developed this habit after a crisis early in her career that she'd made significantly worse by continuing to push at it past the point where she had anything useful to offer. Sometimes the brain needed to work without you watching it. She sat at her window that Tuesday night with a glass of water she didn't drink and went through what she'd read in the last 6 hours. 17 documented communications. The chronology was clear and consistent and cross-referenced with system records that she'd had pulled by 9 that morning. Rafe Calder had not been exaggerating in the conference room. He had not been playing the victim or reframing reality to protect himself. He had sent 17 communications over 26 months about failing systems and been met, systematically, with the particular institutional response that is worse than hostility, because at least hostility requires engagement. He had been met with the quiet, efficient dismissal of someone who has been categorized as manageable. She had built Aldenmore over 22 years. She had started as a financial analyst and worked her way through 4 divisions and 2 acquisitions and a restructuring that had nearly ended the company before she found the right path through it. She had made hard decisions, genuinely hard ones, the kind where there were real costs on every side and no clean answer. She was not naive about the compromises that running a company required, but what she was looking at tonight was not a hard decision that had gone wrong. It was something simpler and more uncomfortable than that. It was a person doing his job correctly, doing it with care and persistence and documentation, and being systematically ignored because the cost of listening to him was inconvenient, and because he was the kind of quiet, reliable presence that institutions learn to take for granted without ever consciously deciding to. She thought about what she'd said to him in that conference room. People like you. She'd meant it as context, as a reminder of stakes, as a way of suggesting that walking away from 11 years of security was irrational. That was how it had felt in the moment. Reasonable, even compassionate, a way of giving him perspective. She understood now, sitting at her window at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, how it had actually sounded, how it had actually been. She had looked at a man who had been right about everything for over 2 years and told him, in the careful language of someone who has learned to exercise power without appearing to, that his stability was contingent on his compliance. He had picked up a cardboard box. She sat with that for a while. She didn't like how it felt. She wasn't supposed to like how it felt. The discomfort was information, and she'd learned a long time ago that the discomfort you most want to avoid is usually the kind that's trying to tell you something. She thought about what the audit report said and what the documentation said, and what her own memory of the previous morning said, and she thought about how those things connected to a pattern she'd been half noticing for a while now. A pattern where operational realities were reaching her pre-processed and reframed by the time they came up through the chain, where the people who actually ran the physical infrastructure of this company were separated from the decision-makers by enough layers that the urgency was gone from the message by the time it arrived. She thought about Rafe Calder sitting across from her with his folder and his steady voice, and the way he'd said, "I used the word urgent. I used the word liability. I used the word risk." Not as an accusation, just as a fact, because the facts were what he had. She refilled her glass at midnight and went to bed and lay there in the dark for a while before anything like sleep came. When it did, it was shallow, and she woke at 5:15 and didn't try to go back. She was at her desk by 6. Rafe woke at 6:20 to his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He looked at it. Unknown number, local area code. He let it go to voicemail. He lay there for a moment in the gray, early morning light, listening to Camille breathe beside him. She was still asleep, one arm over her face the way she always slept when the light came through the curtains. And he thought about what the day was going to require of him. He needed to file for unemployment. He needed to update his resume, which he hadn't touched in 6 years, and which was probably still formatted in a way that would make any HR person under 40 raise an eyebrow. He needed to contact a few people he knew in the industry, carefully, because the industry talked, and he didn't know yet what Aldenmore's version of events was going to be. He needed, basically, to figure out what came next. And he didn't know what came next, which was the part that kept sitting heavily on his chest at 6:20 in the morning. He got up and made coffee and checked the voicemail. It was from a number registered to Aldenmore Group's main corporate line. The message was from Sylvia Crane. Her voice was professional and careful and said only that she'd like to schedule a time to speak with him at his convenience, that there were some matters related to his departure that warranted a conversation, and that she hoped he was doing well. He listened to it twice. Then he poured his coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard, which was brown and frost-flat in the February morning, and thought about whether a person could be doing well 14 hours after walking out of an 11-year career with a cardboard box. He decided the honest answer was, not yet, but possibly eventually, which was maybe the best you could say from this particular vantage point. He set the phone face down on the counter and drank his coffee while it was still hot, which was something he almost never managed to do. His daughter called at 7:30. She was in her senior year of high school, and she'd heard from Camille. Of course she had. Camille wasn't going to keep this from her. And her voice was carefully constructed around the specific anxiety of a 17-year-old who is trying very hard to be adult about something that scares her. "Dad," she said, "Mom told me. Are you okay?" "Yeah," he said, "I'm okay." "Did they try to blame you for everything?" He was quiet for a second. "Where'd that come from?" "Because that's what companies do," she said, with the blunt, unfiltered confidence of someone who was 17 and had not yet learned to temper her assessments. They find the person who is actually doing the right thing, and they make it their fault, because it's easier than admitting the system is broken. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at the frost-flat backyard and thinking about how strange it was that his daughter had just articulated in 20 seconds what had taken him 2 years to fully accept. "You're not wrong," he said. "I know," she said. "Are we going to be okay? Like, financially?" "Yes," he said. "We're going to be okay." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure enough," he said, which was the truth, which was different from being completely sure but was probably more honest than his daughter needed him to be at 7:30 in the morning. "Okay," she said. "Good." And then, after a pause, "I'm proud of you." He didn't know what to do with that. He said thank you and meant it, and they hung up. And he stood there in the kitchen for a moment with the phone in his hand and his coffee cooling on the counter, and the morning light was coming through the window at the angle it always came through in February, thin and indirect and doing its best. He called Sylvia Crane back at 8 o'clock. He wasn't ready to have the conversation she wanted to have, but not calling back wasn't going to make anything better. And he had never been someone who avoided the thing that needed doing just because it was uncomfortable. That had been the whole point, really. That had been what the last 2 years were about. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was composed and professional and had underneath it something that sounded almost like relief, like she'd been sitting by the phone. "Mr. Calder," she said. "Thank you for calling back." "Sure," he said. "What do you need?" There was a pause. "Ms. Voss would like to meet with you," Sylvia said. "When you're ready. There's no timeline. She wanted me to reach out." Rafe looked at his coffee. "About what?" Another pause, careful this time. "She said she's been reviewing the documentation, all of it, and that she'd like the opportunity to speak with you directly." He didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, a neighbor's car started up and backed out of a driveway, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at something. "Tell her I'll think about it," he said. "Of course," Sylvia said. "I'll let her know." He hung up and stood there in the quiet kitchen, and the morning continued to do what mornings do, regardless of what's happening inside the houses they light up. It got a little brighter, and the frost in the backyard started, very slowly, to melt. He thought about it for 3 days before calling Sylvia back. Not because he was being strategic about it, he wasn't built that way, and the idea of calculating his response to Maravos's request felt exhausting in a way that genuine strategy never did. He thought about it because he genuinely didn't know what he wanted, and he'd learned enough about himself over 43 years to understand that when he didn't know what he wanted, the worst thing he could do was act before he did. Camille didn't push him either direction. She asked once, on the second evening, whether he was leaning one way or the other, and he said he wasn't sure. And she nodded and went back to the paper she was grading, and that was the end of it. That was one of the structural things that held their marriage together. She understood the difference between support and pressure, and she applied them accordingly. His daughter texted on the second day. "Did you hear back from them yet?" He typed back, still figuring it out. She sent a thumbs up and left it alone, which was more emotional restraint than he'd had at 17, and which made him quietly proud. On the third morning, he woke at 5:40 and lay there in the dark and thought about Delia. Not about the meeting, not about Maravos, not about what the right move was professionally or financially. He thought about Delia, who had been his safety compliance officer for 4 years, who knew the Meridian Building's mechanical systems better than anyone alive, and who was now navigating the aftermath of the audit and the departure of her supervisor and whatever internal pressure was being applied at Aldenmore without anyone in her corner. He got up and texted her at 6:15. "How are you holding up?" She called him back in 4 minutes, which told him something. "Honestly?" she said when he picked up. "Yeah. It's a mess." Her voice was flat in the way voices get when a person has been holding tension for long enough that they've stopped noticing it. They brought in an outside firm to do a supplemental review of the Meridian systems, which is the right call. But the firm they brought in, Rafe, they've never done a facility this age. They don't know what they're looking at. Are the work orders still visible? For now, Sandra made sure of that. But there's a new guy from corporate. I don't even know his title, something with interim in it. And he keeps wanting to consolidate the documentation, which I think means he wants to reduce the number of items that look like they were flagged and ignored. Rafe pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. "Don't let him." "I'm trying. But I'm a part-time compliance officer, Rafe. I don't have a lot of institutional weight right now without—" She stopped. "Without me there," he said. "Yeah." A pause. "I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty. I know. I want you to know what's happening." He stood in the kitchen with the same early morning light coming through the same window, and he thought about 17 documents and what they had and hadn't been able to accomplish. And he thought about Delia's voice on the phone, flat and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I'm going to call Sylvia Crane today," he said. Delia was quiet for a moment. "To do what?" "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I'm going to call." Sylvia scheduled the meeting for the following Monday. She offered Rafe a neutral location, a conference room on the 14th floor, which was below the executive level, but above the floors where his team worked, a kind of deliberate middle ground. He appreciated the thought behind it without particularly caring about the logistics. He said Monday was fine. He spent the intervening days doing the practical things he'd been putting off. He updated his resume, which took longer than expected because 6 years as a facilities supervisor had produced a body of work that was genuinely hard to translate into bullet points. The things he'd actually done, the systems he'd maintained, and the disasters he'd quietly prevented, and the team he'd built and held together through 3 rounds of budget cuts. None of that fit cleanly into the language resumes required. He worked on it for 2 evenings and ended up with something that was accurate but felt thin. The way all resumes feel thin when you know the full weight of what they're trying to represent. He also called 2 former colleagues from his years before Aldenmore, a facilities manager named Pete, who now ran operations for a mid-sized healthcare company in the region, and a woman named Joanne who'd gone into consulting and had been telling him for years to do the same. Pete said to send him his resume and he'd flag it internally. Joanne said, and she said it immediately, without preamble, "I have 3 clients right now who need exactly what you do. When can you talk?" He said he'd be in touch by the end of the week. He held that call for a while after hanging up. The specific, complicated feeling of being wanted somewhere. The strange relief of it, mixed with the knowledge that wanting him somewhere didn't fix what had happened and didn't make the thing he'd walked out of any less broken. Monday morning, he drove to Aldenmore's building and parked in the visitor section of the garage, which was something he'd never done in 11 years, and took the elevator to the 14th floor. And Sylvia met him at the reception area there and walked him down a carpeted hallway to a conference room that was smaller than the one on the 34th floor and had a window that looked out at the building next door rather than the city. Mara Voss was already there. She was standing at the window when he came in, and she turned when he entered. She looked. He noticed this immediately and filed it without commentary, tired. Not in a disheveled way, because she was still exactly as composed in her appearance as she always was. But there was something in the set of her face that hadn't been there on Tuesday morning, a kind of weight that the conference room on the 34th floor had not contained. "Mr. Calder," she said, "thank you for coming." "Sure," he said. He sat down on the same side of the table as the door, which was not deliberate but was probably instinct. She sat across from him and put her hands on the table. He noticed she had no folder in front of her this time, no briefing materials, no prepared structure, just her hands and the table and the smaller window with the less impressive view. "I've spent the last week going through everything," she said, "the full email history, the budget allocation records, the maintenance request logs, the inspection reports." She paused. "All of it." He waited. "I owe you an apology," she said. "A real one, not the kind that comes with qualifications." He looked at her and tried to read what was underneath the statement because he was a person who had learned, slowly and at some cost, to listen for what was underneath things. He didn't find the calculation he half expected. He found something that looked more like a person who had been up against an uncomfortable truth for 7 days and had not found a way around it. "Okay," he said. "What I said to you about stability and security, about people like you not walking away, that was wrong. It was condescending. And it was wrong at a moment when you had just spent 20 minutes laying out documented evidence that deserved a different response entirely." He didn't say anything immediately. He let the words sit there and checked his own reaction to them, which was complicated in the way that apologies are complicated when you've been waiting for them long enough that you've already made a kind of peace with not getting them. "I appreciate that," he said. "I'm not finished." She looked at him steadily. "The system failed you, and I'm responsible for the system. That's not something I can delegate or contextualize or attribute to budget cycles. The chain of command existed to ensure that information reached decision makers. It didn't work, and the cost of that failure could have been someone getting seriously hurt." "It still could be," he said. "The Meridian Suppression Panel is being addressed. A qualified firm started on site last Wednesday. I pulled in outside contractors and removed the budget ceiling on the repair work." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things. Not asking for credit, just reporting. "Delia is working directly with them. I've asked her to flag anything that looks like it's being minimized." Something loosened slightly in Rafe's chest. "Not all the way, but something." "What happened to Garrett?" he said. Mara's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it became more careful. "That's an ongoing process. I'm not going to give you details that are still in the legal realm. But I can tell you that the Director of Operations role has been vacated and is being rebuilt from different specifications." He nodded. He hadn't asked because he wanted Garrett punished, or not only because of that. He'd asked because the answer would tell him something about whether what she was saying in this room was real, or whether it was the kind of accountability that companies perform for the benefit of documentation. The answer told him it might be real. He wasn't fully convinced yet, but it might be. "What do you want from this meeting?" he said. "Not what you want to give me. What do you actually need out of this conversation?" She looked at him. It was the same look she'd had in the 34th floor conference room, that flat, assessing attention. But it was reading differently now, or he was reading it differently, one or the other. "Honestly," she said. "Yeah. I want to understand how this happened from the inside. I've read the documents. I understand the chronology. What I don't understand is the texture of it, what it actually felt like to be the person sending those memos and getting nothing back. Because I need to understand that if I'm going to do anything meaningful about preventing it from happening again." He looked at her for a moment. "I thought about what an easy thing it would be to stand up right now and say, 'That's not my job anymore,' and walk out the same way he'd walked out a week ago, and how satisfying that would feel for approximately 30 seconds before the reality of it settled in. He thought about Delia's voice on the phone, flat and tired. "All right," he said. "You want the texture? I'll give you the texture." He talked for almost 2 hours. He didn't plan to. He'd come in thinking this would be 30, 40 minutes at most. A polite exchange that would give everyone something to point to. But Mara Voss asked questions that were specific and genuine, and that built on each other in a way that suggested she'd actually read everything she said she'd read, and he found himself going deeper than he'd intended. He talked about what it was like to send the first memo in January and check his email for a week afterward, not because he expected a fast response, but because the nature of the problem meant that every day without a response was a day the problem continued. He talked about the way the silence from above changed how his team functioned, the slow erosion of confidence that happens when workers understand that the person above them has no real authority, that the requests go up and nothing comes back down. He talked about the ceiling incident, which he had documented in a report but had never described out loud to anyone, the way the technician's face looked afterward, the specific, careful way his team had started moving through the Meridian building after that, testing each step a little before committing to it. Not because anyone told them to, but because the building had communicated something to them that the paperwork hadn't. Mara listened. She asked about the budget requests, specifically which numbers she would have needed to see to take action. And he told her, and he also told her that the numbers were in the memos, and she said she knew. And there was a silence between them that was about more than budget figures. She asked about his team, not in a general way. She asked about specific people, by name, which meant she'd gone into the personnel records as well as the maintenance logs. She asked about Sandra and Chris and a man named Harold, who'd been with the Meridian building longer than Rafe had been with Aldenmore. Harold's been patching the same 3 systems with parts he sources himself because the procurement process takes 12 to 16 weeks, and the systems can't wait 12 to 16 weeks, Rafe said. He's good at it. He keeps a log of everything he uses and what it cost and why he couldn't wait for official channels. That log exists. Nobody above my level has ever asked to see it. I want to see it, she said. He looked at her. You'd have to ask him directly. I'm not his supervisor anymore. I know, she said. I will. They sat in a kind of quiet for a moment after that. Not uncomfortable exactly. More like 2 people who have covered a lot of ground and are taking inventory of where they've ended up. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. Before last Tuesday, before the audit results came in, had you heard my name? Not the department, my name specifically. She was quiet for a moment. The honest kind of quiet, not the calculating kind. No, she said. I hadn't. That's what I thought, he said. Not with bitterness, just as a fact. Is that... She stopped, started again. What does that mean to you? That I hadn't heard your name? He looked at the window, the building next door, a row of identical panes reflecting gray February sky. It means the system was doing exactly what systems like that do, he said. It means 11 years of work, including 2 years of urgent documented warnings, got filtered out before it reached the person who could have done something about it. Not maliciously, just efficiently. The system was designed to protect the people at the top from information that would require uncomfortable action, and it worked exactly as designed. She absorbed that. And what do I do with that? I don't know, he said. That's your problem to solve. I just lived inside it. He drove home in the early afternoon with the kind of emotional exhaustion that comes not from conflict but from honesty. The particular depletion of having said true things to someone you're not sure you fully trust yet, of having given over something real without knowing what they'll do with it. Camille was home when he got there, a workday this time, but her planning period, and she was in the kitchen again with coffee that had probably gone lukewarm again, and she looked at his face when he came in. How was it? She said. I don't know yet, he said. Which was true. Which was the same answer he'd been giving to a lot of things lately, and which was beginning to feel less like uncertainty and more like an accurate description of where he was. Did she actually apologize? Yeah. Did it feel real? He got a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Parts of it did, he said. The part about the documentation felt real. The part about Garrett felt managed. Like she was saying what she could say without crossing into legal territory. That's probably just reality, Camille said. Probably. He drank half the glass. She wants to understand the system, how it failed. She asked good questions. And you answered them. For 2 hours. Camille raised her eyebrows. You talked to Mara Voss for 2 hours. I know. Rafe, you don't talk to me for 2 hours. He almost laughed. It was the first time something had gotten close to a real laugh since Tuesday morning a week ago, and the closeness of it surprised him. She asked better questions, he said. Camille threw a dish towel at him. It was light and inaccurate and landed on the floor between them, which was exactly the kind of moment that kept a marriage functional across 20 years. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they had a shape, which helped. Rafe called Joanne back on Thursday and had a real conversation about consulting. She had 3 clients, as she'd said, and 2 of them were dealing with exactly the kind of deferred maintenance meets regulatory exposure problem that Rafe had spent 2 years trying to get someone at Aldenmore to pay attention to. She proposed a structure. He'd come in as an independent contractor, project-based. She'd handle the business side, and he'd handle the technical assessments and recommendations. He said he'd think about it over the weekend. He thought about it. He talked it over with Camille, who asked practical questions about tax structure and liability, and whether Joanne was the kind of person who paid on time, all of which were the right questions. He also talked to Pete, who'd once done a consulting stint between full-time roles and who said the hardest part wasn't the work, it was the absence of the team, the specific loneliness of being good at something without having people around you who were also trying to do it. That landed. He'd been sitting with a version of that feeling since the morning he'd cleaned out his office, a hollowness that wasn't about the job exactly, but about the 19 people who'd been part of how the job worked. Delia and Sandra and Chris and Harold and the 14 others, the morning texts about broken equipment and the afternoon runs to the hardware store, and the particular shared dark humor of people who hold things together for organizations that don't fully appreciate that the holding together is happening. He texted Delia that Thursday evening, "How's Harold?" She wrote back, fixing the same 3 systems. The outside firm finally asked him about his parts log. He made them wait while he photocopied it. He stared at that for a moment and felt something that was close to pride and also close to sadness. The 2 things sitting right next to each other the way they sometimes do. "Good," he typed back. He called Joanne on Friday and said yes. Well, the thing about starting over at 43 is that it doesn't look the way you imagine it will when you're younger, and starting over is still theoretical. When you're 25 and you imagine starting over, you imagine clean slates and open roads and a sense of possibility that has its own propulsive energy. At 43, starting over looks more like a Tuesday morning in your kitchen with lukewarm coffee and a resume that feels thin and a phone you keep checking for messages from people who are still inside the institution you left. It wasn't hopeless. He never felt hopeless, which he noticed and was grateful for because he'd half expected to. What he felt instead was a low, persistent uncertainty that he had to keep making active decisions not to let run the narrative. Every morning he had to choose, not dramatically but practically, to do the next useful thing instead of sitting with the uncertainty. Update the resume. Call Joanne. Answer Pete's email. Research the licensing requirements for independent safety consulting in the state. The days were long in a way that employed days aren't. When you have a job, time is always being consumed by something, and the problem is usually that there isn't enough of it. When the job is gone, time opens up into this strange flat expanse, and you have to figure out how to fill it with things that matter, which turns out to require more intention than it sounds like it should. He started walking every morning, not because he had a fitness goal. He wasn't built for goals that were primarily about himself in that way, but because it gave the day an anchor. An hour in the morning before the day started, through the neighborhood, past the elementary school, and the dry cleaner, and the park that was still frost dead in February, just walking and letting his mind do what it needed to do. He thought about things on those walks, about what the last 2 years had cost him in ways he was only beginning to account for, not financially, but in the quieter currency of things like peace of mind and trust in his own judgment. He thought about all the times he'd second-guessed himself after a meeting with Garrett, all the times he'd gone home and wondered if maybe the budget really did justify the deferral. Maybe he was being too conservative. Maybe the systems were more stable than his assessment suggested. He'd never fully believed those doubts, but he'd had to fight them, and the fighting had cost something. On one of those walks, about 12 days after the meeting with Mara, he ran into Marcus. The security guard from the Alden Moore lobby who had said good morning to him for 11 years. Marcus was walking a dog, a large, inefficient-looking golden retriever who immediately tried to investigate Rafe's shoes with tremendous enthusiasm. "Hey, Mr. Calder," Marcus said. He looked surprised, and then immediately tried to look like he hadn't been surprised, which made the surprise more visible. "Marcus." Rafe bent down and let the dog smell his hand. "What's his name?" "Chester. He's my wife's." Marcus looked at him carefully. "How are you doing?" "Getting there," Rafe said. "People miss you," Marcus said. "I hear things in the lobby, people talking. They know it wasn't right." Rafe scratched Chester behind the ear and thought about what to say to that. "I appreciate it," he said finally. "Take care of yourself." "You too, Mr. Calder." He walked home from that with something sitting differently in his chest. Not better exactly, but more settled, the way a bruise feels when the acute pain has started to shift into something duller and more manageable. He was beginning to understand that what had happened to him was not going to be something he simply got over, the way you get over a cold or a bad week. It was something he was going to carry and gradually learn the weight of, which was different. That was fine. He could carry things. He'd been carrying things for a long time. Back inside Alden Moore, things were moving in ways that Rafe wasn't witnessing but would eventually hear about. Mara Voss had come back from the meeting on Monday and spent 2 days writing something she didn't usually write. A personal memo, addressed to no one specific, that she worked on and revised, and that was really more a process of thinking on paper than communication. She wrote about what Rafe had told her, the texture of it, the ceiling incident in Harold's parts log, and the slow erosion of confidence that happens to a team when they understand that the person above them has no real authority. She wrote about the filter, her word, from something Rafe had said, the way the system was designed to protect decision-makers from information that required uncomfortable action. She kept coming back to one thing he'd said. "I used the word urgent. I used the word liability. I used the word risk." She had underlined it in the printed transcript Sylvia had made of the meeting, which she'd asked for because she wanted something she could return to. She had underlined it and then sat with it for a while, thinking about all the communications that passed through the layers of an organization the size of Alden Moore and what happened to urgency in transit, how it gets smoothed and qualified and reframed until it arrives at the top looking like a manageable concern rather than a fire. She called a meeting with her 4 division heads on Thursday. Not to present conclusions, she didn't have conclusions yet, not ones she trusted, but to ask questions. She asked each of them to tell her about the last time a piece of operational information had surprised them. Not bad news, surprises specifically. Things that arrived with urgency that they hadn't seen coming. The answers were revealing in the way that answers to unexpected questions often are. 2 of the division heads described scenarios that sounded like smaller versions of exactly what had happened with Rafe in the Meridian building. Warnings that had existed at operational levels and hadn't surfaced cleanly to the decision level until something forced them to. One of them described it almost exactly. "By the time it gets to me, someone's already decided what I need to know about it." Mara wrote that down. She was building something. She could feel it taking shape, though she didn't have the architecture for it yet. An understanding of what had broken and why, which was the necessary precondition for fixing it. She had been running companies for 22 years, and she knew that the impulse to move straight to solutions was almost always a mistake, that the seductiveness of action was one of the things that most reliably produced the next crisis. She needed to understand it first. All of it. She pulled Harold's parts log on a Friday afternoon. Delia had sent it over, scanned, 47 pages. Mara read all 47 pages at her desk that evening, after her assistant had gone home and the floor was quiet, and what she found in those pages was something she hadn't expected. Not just a record of parts and costs and procurement workarounds, but a kind of running commentary in Harold's handwriting, notes in the margins and between the entries, observations about the systems he was working on that were dry and precise and occasionally darkly funny in the way that people who work with broken things develop a particular humor about it. One entry, from 14 months ago, read, "Third time this month on the East Wing suppression relay. Manufacturer spec says replace at this failure rate. Haven't been able to get a PO approved. Used salvage part. Documented here. Not ideal. Works for now." Check in 60 days. 60 days later, there was another entry. Checking is noted. Holding, but stressed. Flagged to Rafe per protocol. Waiting on budget approval. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about Harold, whom she had never met, who had been keeping this log for years in the methodical way of someone who understood that the paperwork was the only protection available to him, that if something went wrong, the log was what proved he'd done his job correctly. She thought about the 47 pages of it and what they represented. A man making it work day after day, with inadequate resources, documenting everything because documentation was all he had. She thought about Rafe Calder, who had built the kind of team that produced a Harold. That was not an accident. People like Harold existed inside institutions because someone had created conditions where meticulous, unglamorous, essential work was taken seriously. Someone had made it matter. Someone had fought, budget cycle after budget cycle, to keep the Delia who understood the compliance systems, and the Harold who kept the parts log, and the Sandra who made sure the work orders stayed visible when the pressure came to make them disappear. She closed the scan and sat in the quiet of her office and thought about the person she had looked across a conference table and told that people like him never walk away. She had been wrong about what kind of person he was. She had been wrong in a way that had taken her a week of documentation and a 47-page handwritten log to fully understand, and the understanding sat in her chest now with a specific gravity that she recognized as the weight of accountability. Not the managed legal adjacent variety, but the real kind, which doesn't resolve cleanly and doesn't come with a timeline and just has to be carried until it becomes part of how you see things. She picked up her phone and looked at it for a moment. Then she set it back down. It was Friday evening, and whatever needed to happen next could wait until Monday, and she needed to give herself the weekend to think without acting, which was still the harder discipline for her, even after 22 years. She turned off her office light and went home in the dark, and the glass tower behind her reflected the city lights in its windows the way it always did, looking from the outside exactly like what it was supposed to be. The Monday after she read Harold's log, Mara Voss came into the office at 6:50 and asked her assistant to clear the first 2 hours of her calendar. Her assistant, a precise and unflappable woman named Grace, who had worked with Mara for 9 years and had learned to read the specific gravity of different kinds of early morning arrivals, cleared the calendar without asking why, and brought coffee without being asked. Mara spent those 2 hours doing something she almost never did. She went back through her own decisions. Not in the way that people go back through decisions when they're looking for justification. She'd done enough of that kind of review in corporate settings to recognize it immediately and distrust it. She went back through them looking for the pattern. The specific shape of how things had failed, not at Garrett's level, not at the operational level, but at hers. The question she kept returning to was simple and uncomfortable. At what point had the Aldenmore Group become the kind of company where a man like Rafe Calder spent 2 years sending urgent documented warnings into a void? Not when had it happened. She had the timeline now. She understood the sequence of events. But at what point had she specifically made choices or failed to make choices that allowed that kind of institutional silence to become normal? She had a theory by 8:30, and the theory was not about Garrett Finch, though Garrett was part of it. The theory was about what she had chosen to measure. For the past several years, Aldenmore's internal performance metrics had been built almost entirely around financial indicators and client satisfaction scores. These were reasonable things to measure, but they were lagging indicators. They told you how things had gone, not how things were going, and they were susceptible to the exact kind of upstream filtration that Rafe had described. By the time a problem was visible in a financial metric, it had already been real at the operational level for months, possibly years. And the people who knew about it had probably already said so to someone who'd already decided what to pass upward. She wrote 3 things on a legal pad and looked at them for a while. Then she called her CFO. His name was Dennis Park, and he was good at his job in the particular way of someone who understood that being good at his job meant occasionally telling Mara things she didn't want to hear. She had hired him partly for that quality, though she hadn't always rewarded it as consistently as she should have. "I need to talk to you about how we measure operational health," she said. Dennis was quiet for a moment. "Is this about the Calder situation?" "It's about what the Calder situation exposed," she said, "which is different." "Okay," he said. "When?" "This afternoon, and bring whoever does our internal audit function. I want all 3 of us in the same room." She spent the morning on the other part of it, the personnel part, which was more complicated and which had been sitting in a legal holding pattern since the week before. Garrett Finch's attorneys had been in contact with Alden Moore's legal team, and the conversation had reached the point where the shape of a separation agreement was visible, even if the details weren't finalized. Mara had told legal to proceed without her in the room, which was what you did when you wanted the process to move cleanly without executive involvement, muddying the evidentiary waters. But there were two other people she needed to address, and those conversations didn't have legal teams in them. The first was a senior operations manager named Terrence Webb, who had been Garrett's direct deputy and who had received copies of at least 4 of Rafe's escalated memos, and had, as far as Mara could reconstruct, done nothing with them. She met with Terrence at 10:15. He was 48, careful-looking, the kind of person who had built a career on being reliably present and reliably inoffensive, and who was currently discovering that those qualities were not the same as being reliably right. He came in knowing it was serious. She could tell from the way he sat, forward slightly, hands visible on the table, the posture of a person who has decided that projecting openness is their best available strategy. "Terrence," she said, "I want to understand your role in the Meridian situation. Not from a disciplinary standpoint right now. I want to understand what you knew and when." He talked for 12 minutes. Mara listened without interrupting, which was harder than it sounded because what he described was a decision-making process that was, in its own internal logic, almost coherent. He'd received the memos. He'd flagged the budget implications to Garrett. Garrett had said he was handling it, and Terrence had concluded that his role was complete. He had not followed up. He had not pushed. He had not asked whether action had been taken. When he finished, she said, "At any point, did you think the situation was urgent?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought it was a concern," he said carefully. "That's not what I asked." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes," he said finally, "I thought it was probably urgent." "And you concluded that Garrett handling it was sufficient." "He was my supervisor." "He was," she said, "and above him was me, and I didn't know about it. So the question I need you to sit with, Terrence, not answer right now, but sit with, is where in that chain the urgency disappeared, and whether any part of that disappearance was a choice." He looked at the table. Something in his face had shifted, the careful openness replaced by something more unguarded and less comfortable. "I understand," he said. "I'm going to need you in a different role while we restructure operations," she said. "A transitional capacity. You'll work directly with the new compliance framework we're building. That's not a demotion announcement. It's a process, and it starts today." He nodded. He looked like a man who had expected worse and wasn't entirely sure he deserved better, which was probably the right place for him to be. The second conversation was with a woman named Patricia Howell, who ran internal communications, and who had, in the 3 days after Rafe's departure, sent 2 all-staff emails that described the situation in language so carefully processed that it communicated nothing except that something had happened and that leadership was addressing it. Mara had read both emails at the time and approved them, which she now recognized as a mistake, not a malicious one, but a reflexive one, the impulse to manage the narrative rather than engage with it. She told Patricia that the next communication needed to be different. "I want it to be honest," she said. "Not legally exposed, but honest. People in this company know what happened. They're watching to see whether we pretend it didn't." Patricia looked uncomfortable. "That's a significant departure from our usual approach." "Yes," Mara said. "That's the point." The meeting with Dennis Park and the internal audit director, a quiet and thorough woman named Ruth Castillo, lasted 3 hours and covered more ground than Mara had planned. What emerged by the end of it was not a solution. It was a map of the problem, which was the prerequisite for a solution, and which was more than Alden Moore had had a week ago. The existing performance measurement system had, as Mara had suspected, been built in a way that made operational early warnings structurally invisible at the executive level. The metrics that mattered for quarterly reporting were clean and financial, and 2 to 3 steps removed from what was actually happening in the buildings and systems and teams that the company depended on. Ruth had pulled comparison data from 3 peer organizations that had implemented what she called operational transparency frameworks, regular structured channels for ground-level information to reach executive visibility without passing through the filtration of middle management. She laid it out on the table with the careful neutrality of someone who is presenting facts and letting the facts do the arguing. If something like this had been in place, Dennis said, looking at the data, we'd have seen the meridian pattern 6 months in, maybe earlier. Yes, Ruth said. And we didn't build it, Dennis said, more to himself than to either of them, because no one was asking for it. No one above the operational level was asking for it, Mara said. People below that level were asking for it constantly. They were asking for it every time they sent a memo that disappeared. The room was quiet for a moment. Okay, Dennis said. So what does building it actually look like? They spent the next 90 minutes on that. It was not a clean conversation. There were disagreements about scope and cost and timeline, and Ruth pushed back on two of Mara's initial proposals in ways that were correct and that Mara accepted. And Dennis raised a financial concern about the staffing requirements that was legitimate and that required them to revise the model twice. By the end of it, they had something that was closer to a working draft than a plan, which was still more than they'd started with. Mara looked at the draft on the table and thought about how long it would take to make it real. And then she thought about Harold and his parts log and 47 pages of a man doing his job correctly in the margins of an institution that had never looked at what he was writing. I want to move on this in 30 days, she said. Dennis looked up. 30 days is aggressive. I know. Mara, I know, she said again. Do what you can in 30 days. What isn't done in 30 days, we finish in 60. But I want something real in place in 30 days. Not a committee, not a working group, something that functions. Dennis looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at her notes. We can have the measurement framework and the reporting channels operational in 30 days, Ruth said. The staffing component will take longer. That's enough for 30 days, Mara said. Start there. Rafe had been doing consulting work for 2 weeks when his phone rang on a Wednesday afternoon with Sylvia Crane's number. He was at his kitchen table with a site assessment report for one of Joanne's clients, a distribution facility that had the specific combination of aging infrastructure and optimistic maintenance scheduling that he'd spent 11 years navigating at Aldenmore. And he answered it with the particular caution of someone who has learned to distinguish between calls that want something from him and calls that are offering something. Mr. Calder, Sylvia said, I hope I'm not interrupting. It's fine, what's up? Ms. Voss would like to meet again, if you're open to it. She has a specific proposal she'd like to discuss in person. He put his pen down. What kind of proposal? She asked me not to characterize it in advance, Sylvia said. She'd rather explain it herself. But she wanted me to tell you that it's not a conversation about returning to your previous role. He looked at the site assessment report on his table, at the photographs of a facility whose deferred maintenance issues were almost comforting in their familiarity. Tell her I can do Thursday, he said. Thursday works. Same location as before? Fine. He hung up and sat there for a moment. Then he called Camille. Sylvia Crane called, he said when she picked up. And? Mara Voss wants to meet again, says she has a proposal. A pause. Are you going? Thursday. Another pause. Different quality this time. Rafe, what do you want? It was the question she'd been asking, in one form or another, since the morning he came home with the cardboard box, and he'd been giving her variations of the same honest answer, I don't know yet. But sitting at his kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon with a site assessment report in front of him, and 2 weeks of consulting work behind him and the quiet of the house around him, he found that the answer had shifted slightly. He didn't know exactly what he wanted, but he knew what he didn't want, and the not wanting had a shape now that helped him see the edges of what might be on the other side of it. I want what happened to mean something, he said. Camille was quiet for a moment. Then go Thursday and see what she's built out of it, she said. You can always say no. He arrived 8 minutes early on Thursday, which was his habit, and Sylvia walked him to the same room on the 14th floor. The window still looked out at the building next door. The carpet was the same. He sat in the same chair. Mara Voss came in 4 minutes later, and this time she had a folder, but she set it on the table without opening it and sat down and looked at him with the same steady attention she'd had in every meeting they'd ever had, which was perhaps the most consistent thing about her. Thank you for coming back, she said. Sure, he said. Sylvia said you had a proposal. I do. She didn't reach for the folder. But before I get to that, I want to tell you what's happened in the past 2 weeks. Not as preamble, because I think you've earned knowing. He nodded. She told him. Not in a summary way, but specifically. The conversation with her division heads, the 3-hour meeting with Dennis and Ruth, the operational transparency framework they were building. She told him about Terrence Webb and what she'd said to him and what he'd admitted about knowing the situation was urgent and deciding that Garrett handling it was sufficient. She told him about Patricia Howell and the internal communications approach and why she'd changed it. She told him about Harold's log, which she didn't need to tell him about but did anyway, and what it had meant to read it. He listened. He'd gotten better at listening in the past 3 weeks, partly because he had more time for it, and partly because he discovered that the listening, done without an agenda, told you things that the talking never quite got to. When she finished, he said, "Did you talk to Harold directly?" "Last week," she said. He's a very particular person." "Yeah. He told me the parts log wasn't for the company," she said. "He said he kept it for himself, so he'd know he'd done the job right regardless of what happened around him." Rafe looked at the window. He knew that about Harold. He'd known it for years, the same way he'd known things about all the people on his team. Not because they'd told him, but because you learn what drives people when you work alongside them long enough and pay attention. Harold kept the log because the log was the proof, available to himself if to no one else, that he'd been honest. That was the kind of person Harold was, and finding that kind of person and creating conditions where they could do their best work was, Rafe had come to understand, the actual substance of what he did. Not the maintenance schedules or the procurement processes or the regulatory compliance. The people. "What's the proposal?" he said. Mara opened the folder for the first time. She slid a single page across the table. He picked it up. It was a job description. Not a formal HR posting, but a working draft, the kind you write when you're still figuring out what the role actually is. The title at the top read, Director of Operational Integrity and Safety Systems. He read it. It took a while because there was more on the page than a typical job description carries. It described not just responsibilities, but authorities, which was the part that caught his attention and held it. The role included direct reporting access to the CEO, independent budget authority for safety-critical repairs up to a defined threshold, and the explicit right to escalate any operational concern to executive review without passing through the standard chain of command. It also included the authority to reject budget proposals that the role determined created unacceptable operational risk. He read that line twice. "This is real?" he said. "It's a draft," she said. "I want your input on it before it's final. The threshold numbers are placeholders. I want you to tell me what makes operational sense." He set the page down. "This is a significant amount of authority for a new position." "Yes. People are going to push back on it." "Some already have," she said. Dennis Park had concerns about the budget authority scope. We revised it twice. What's on that page is the version that emerged from those revisions, which means it's the version that had to survive some pressure. It's not a piece of paper someone wrote in a good mood. He looked at it again. He thought about what it would mean to hold that role. To be the person inside Aldenmore who had the institutional weight to say this is not safe and have it mean something, to have the documentation backed by authority instead of just by integrity. He thought about Delia and Sandra and Harold and what it would mean for them to have someone above them who could actually move. He also thought about what it would mean for him personally. To go back. To walk back into the building where he'd carried a cardboard box to an elevator 3 weeks ago and taken it down to the lobby and driven away with his hands shaking on the steering wheel. There was something in the idea of going back that was complicated in ways he hadn't fully worked through. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "Why me?" Not rhetorically. Specifically. You could build this role and hire someone from outside who doesn't have the history, doesn't have the complicated relationship with this institution. "Why me?" She was quiet for a moment. Not the calculating kind of quiet, the honest kind. "Because I read 17 memos," she said, "and then I read 47 pages of a parts log kept by a man who works for you. And the thing those two documents have in common is that they were both produced by people who cared about doing the job correctly when there was no immediate reward for doing so. That kind of culture doesn't build itself." She paused. "You built it. Inside an institution that was actively working against it. I want someone who can do that with the institution working with them instead." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about something Camille had said. "You can always say no." Which was true. He could say no right now, walk out with his consulting work and his site assessments and his new professional life that was still being constructed, but that was his in a way that his work at Aldenmore had stopped being. He could say no, and it would be a legitimate decision and probably the easier one. "I need two things before I can say yes," he said. "Tell me." Delia Marks gets a full-time contract, not part-time, not project-based, full-time, with a title that reflects what she actually does and a salary to match. Mara nodded once. "Done." "And the operational transparency framework you described, the reporting channels, the measurement systems. I want to be involved in designing them, not consulted, involved. Because the people who are going to live inside those systems need to have input in how they're built, and the person overseeing safety and operational integrity should be part of building the integrity structures." Mara looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, just a small change. The kind that happens when a person has been expecting negotiation and gets something different. "Also done," she said. He looked at the page on the table between them. The title at the top. The authorities listed below it. He thought about what it would cost and what it might be worth, and he thought about Harold's log and Delia's tired voice on the phone, and the technician standing under a ceiling that had partially given way, and the specific look on that technician's face afterward. Not fear, more like understanding. And he thought about what it meant to have the chance to make sure that look happened less. "I'm going to need to talk to my wife," he said. "Of course. And I have a consulting commitment I need to honor through the end of the month." "The start date is negotiable," she said, "within reason." He nodded. He picked up the draft job description and folded it once and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. "I'll have an answer by Monday," he said. "That's fine." She paused. "Can I ask what you're going to think about over the weekend?" He looked at her. "Whether this institution is actually capable of being different," he said, "or whether I'd be walking back into the same building with a better title and the same fundamental problem." She held his gaze. "That's the right question." "I know," he said. "That's why I need the weekend." He drove home in the mid-afternoon and found Camille's car already in the driveway. Her last class ended at 2 on Thursdays. He sat in his car for a moment before going in, which was a habit he seemed to have developed for major thresholds, and looked at the house. Their house, which he and Camille had bought 14 years ago when the neighborhood was still on its way up rather than arrived, and which had a front porch they used maybe 6 times a year and a backyard that was only now beginning to show the first faint green at the edges of the frost-killed grass. He went inside and Camille was in the kitchen, which at this point felt like a law of physics, and she looked at his face when he came in, the way she always looked at his face when he came in from something that mattered. "Well?" she said. He took the folded job description out of his jacket pocket and put it on the table. She picked it up and read it. He watched her read it, which took a while because Camille read carefully and he hadn't told her to rush. When she finished, she set it down and looked at him. "Director of Operational Integrity," she said. "It's a draft. The budget authority is real? If I push back on the threshold numbers, yes." She looked at the page again, then at him. "What did she say when you asked her why you?" He told her. He told her the whole conversation, not in the condensed version he sometimes gave when he was still processing something, but the full version, the Harold's log part and the culture part, and the two things he'd asked for, and the way Mara had said also done without pausing. Camille listened. She sat across from him at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee that was probably lukewarm again, and she listened the way she'd been listening for 3 weeks, without rushing into the spaces, letting things exist before she responded to them. When he finished, she said, "Delia gets the full-time contract without negotiating." First response? Yes. "And you're worried about going back?" "I'm worried about going back and finding out in 6 months that the paper was real, but the institution wasn't," he said. "That the framework gets built and looks good in a presentation and then slowly gets deprioritized the next time there's a budget crunch." "That could happen," Camille said. "Yeah. But it also couldn't." She looked at him steadily. "And you'd have more ability to prevent it from happening from inside than from wherever else you'd be." He looked at the draft on the table. He thought about the consulting work, Joanne's clients, the site assessments, the professional independence of it. He thought about what Joanne had said when he'd told her about the meeting. She'd been quiet for a moment and then said, "Is this the kind of change that only happens once?" And he hadn't known how to answer that. He still didn't know. He thought maybe that was what the weekend was for, not to get a definitive answer, but to sit with the question long enough that the answer that came wasn't reactive, wasn't about fear or pride, or the particular appeal of a narrative where he stayed gone and was vindicated from the outside. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from Delia. Heard there was another meeting. You okay? He looked at the message for a moment. Then he typed back, yeah, call you tomorrow. She sent a thumbs up. He set the phone down. I'm going to take a walk, he said. Camille nodded. Take your time, she said, which was what she always said, and which always meant exactly what it said. He went out the front door and down the porch steps and turned left on the sidewalk, the direction he'd been going every morning for 3 weeks. The neighborhood was in that particular early evening state where the day hadn't finished, but the light was already thinking about leaving, long shadows across the sidewalk and the sound of other people's dinners starting up behind closed windows. He walked for 40 minutes. He thought about what Mara had said about building a culture inside an institution that was working against it. He thought about what it might look like to build the same thing inside an institution that was trying, imperfectly, and with all the friction that real institutional change carries, to work with it instead. He thought about the cardboard box, which was still in his closet, because he hadn't gotten around to breaking it down for recycling. He thought about what it had meant when he picked it up, and what it might mean now, 3 weeks later, with a draft job description in his jacket pocket and a question he needed to live inside until Monday. He turned around at the park and walked home in the last of the light, and the houses on his street glowed amber and warm against the blue darkening sky. And he went up the porch steps and through the front door, and Camille had started dinner, and it smelled like something that required time and patience, the kind of meal you make when you're not in a hurry for the evening to be over. He washed his hands and stood next to her at the counter, and she handed him a cutting board and a knife without being asked, because after 20 years you stop asking, and they worked together in the quiet kitchen while the evening came down around the house. And he didn't know yet what Monday would bring, but he knew this. Whatever he decided, it would be because he'd chosen it, which was the only kind of decision he'd ever been able to live with. He called Sylvia Crane on Monday morning at 8:15, not because he'd made up his mind over the weekend in some clean, decisive moment. It hadn't worked like that. It had worked the way most real decisions work, which is that you turn the thing over and over until one side of it starts to feel heavier than the other, and then you sit with that weight long enough to trust it. By Sunday evening, the weight had settled, and he knew which way it had gone. And so Monday morning, he made the call. Tell her yes, he said. With the conditions we discussed. Sylvia's voice carried the specific professional warmth of someone who is genuinely relieved but is paid to sound merely pleasant. I'll let her know. We'll have the formal documentation to you by Wednesday. He hung up and sat at his kitchen table with his coffee and looked at the backyard, which after weeks of February brown was beginning, at its edges, to show something green. Not much. Just the suggestion of it. The kind of change that happens slowly and then all at once, the way most real changes do. He called Joanne next, because that conversation was necessary, and because he owed her the courtesy of not letting her hear it from anywhere else first. I had a feeling, she said, when he'd finished explaining. I'm sorry to pull out of the Henderson assessment. Don't be, she paused. Rafe, is this the right move? I think so, he said. You think so or you know so? He looked at the backyard. I think so with enough conviction that I'm treating it like I know so. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. That's the most honest answer anyone's given me in about 6 months. Okay. Stay in touch. If it goes sideways, call me. I will, he said. He called Delia last, because that conversation was the one he'd been turning over all weekend, the one that had more layers than the others. She picked up on the first ring. You took the job, she said. Not a question. How'd you know? Because you called instead of texted. You only call when it's something you need to actually say out loud. He hadn't known that about himself. He filed it. Yeah, he said. I took it. She was quiet for a moment. Does the full-time contract thing? It's in the conditions, he said. Non-negotiable. It's done. Another silence, different this time. When she spoke again, her voice had a quality he hadn't heard from her since before the audit. Something lighter underneath the usual flatness. Okay, she said. Okay, good. You're still going to have to do most of the actual work, he said. I know. I've been doing most of the actual work for 4 years. But there was something close to dry humor in it, which was the Delia he knew, the one who had been buried under 6 weeks of institutional uncertainty, starting to resurface. I'll be in on the first, he said. Start getting your documentation in order. I'm going to want a full picture of where everything stands from day one. Already started, she said. I started that the morning after you left, just in case. He shook his head slowly. Of course you did. His first day back was on a Thursday, the 1st of March, which meant he'd been gone 5 weeks and 2 days. He drove to the building and parked in the regular employee section of the garage, not the visitor section, and rode the elevator up. He'd thought it might feel strange, returning to a place he'd left in the specific way he'd left it. It felt strange, but not in the way he'd anticipated. It felt less like going back and more like entering something that was, in small but real ways, not quite the same place he'd walked out of. The carpet on the 14th floor, his floor now, the one where his new office sat, was the same carpet. The light through the windows was the same pale March light. But Sylvia met him at the elevator and walked him down a hallway. He hadn't been down before, to an office with his name on a placard that was still slightly crooked, and inside the office was a desk and a window and a filing cabinet. And sitting on the desk, a coffee from the place down the street that Delia had clearly gone to before he arrived. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the office. It was not a large office. It was not the kind of office that announced itself. But it had the specific quality of a space that was entirely his to define, and that felt like something. He set his bag down and picked up the coffee and drank it while it was still hot. Delia appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later with a binder that was 3 inches thick. I need 2 hours of your morning, she said. You have it, he said. Close the door. The first 30 days were not smooth. He had not expected them to be smooth, but the specific texture of the difficulty was instructive. The operational transparency framework that Dennis Park and Ruth Castillo had been building was functional in its basic structure, but had gaps that became visible the moment real operational data started flowing through it. Rafe spent the second week of March working with Ruth to redesign 2 of the reporting channels, which required convincing 3 department heads that the new system was not a surveillance mechanism, but a communication one, a distinction that seemed obvious from where Rafe sat and was apparently not obvious at all from where they sat. He had those conversations one at a time, in their offices, not in conference rooms. He'd learned from 11 years of facilities work that the location of a conversation changes its character, and that people are more honest in their own space than in neutral territory. He went to them. He asked questions. He explained what the system was designed to do and what it wasn't designed to do, and he listened to their concerns with the specific attention of someone who understood that resistance to change is often just fear of exposure dressed in reasonable language, but that the fear underneath is real and deserves engagement. Some of them came around quickly. One of them, a division head named Carl, who had been at Alden Moore for 16 years, and who had the settled, slightly defensive posture of someone who has survived multiple leadership regimes by being difficult to dislodge, pushed back for 2 full weeks before a conversation on a Thursday afternoon that went longer than expected and ended with him saying, grudgingly but genuinely, "If it actually works the way you're describing, I can see the value." "It will work the way I'm describing if people use it honestly," Rafe said. "And if they don't?" "Then we'll know fairly quickly, because the system will tell us," Rafe said. "That's the point." Carl looked at him with the eyes of a man who was recalibrating. "You're not interested in making anyone look bad." "I'm interested in making sure the buildings are safe and the people in them are protected," Rafe said. "If that makes someone look bad along the way, that's a consequence, not a goal." Carl nodded slowly. He looked like he was deciding something. "All right," he said. "I'll run the pilot in my division." That was the week 4 breakthrough Rafe had needed, because Carl was the oldest institutional voice in the room, and when Carl moved, other people found it easier to move. He met with Mara Voss every 2 weeks. Not long meetings, 45 minutes, an agenda prepared in advance, focused on what was moving and what wasn't. It was different from the meetings they'd had before, when there were only 3 of them, and all of them were shaped by the specific tension of accountability and apology and the careful negotiation of what came next. These meetings were functional. They had friction in them, the normal kind that comes from 2 people who see things differently and are both trying to be right about things that matter. In the 3rd week of March, She pushed back on a budget request he'd made for emergency repair authorization at the Kellerton facility, a newer building but one that had developed a water intrusion problem that Rafe's assessment said was progressing faster than the existing timeline allowed for. The capital allocation cycle doesn't support an off-cycle authorization at this number, she said. I understand that, he said. The water intrusion doesn't care about the capital allocation cycle. She looked at the assessment he'd submitted. Ruth's team reviewed this? Yesterday. She's in agreement on the timeline. A pause. What happens if we hold to the scheduled review? Best case, we catch it in June, and the repair cost is 3 times what it is now. Worst case, we have a structural failure before June, and the cost is considerably higher. Plus, we're explaining to regulators why we had a documented assessment indicating urgency and didn't act on it. She held his gaze. He held it back because this was the exact conversation the role had been built for, and he was not going to be the one who looked away from it. I'll have Dennis review the capital reallocation options by end of week, she said finally. I want a second number from you. If we can only do partial authorization now, what's the minimum intervention that buys us safe time to June? I can have that to you by tomorrow morning, he said. Good. It wasn't a perfect outcome. The partial authorization they ended up with was less than Rafe had wanted, and he said so in the meeting where it was approved, and Mara said she heard him and that the remaining scope was scheduled for June without exception, and he wrote that down and made sure Ruth's team documented it, because documentation was still the thing he trusted most. But it was a different conversation than any conversation he'd had in 11 years of sending memos into the institutional dark. It was a conversation that produced a decision, in a room where the urgency hadn't been filtered out before it arrived. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole thing. Harold came to find him in the 3rd week of March. Rafe was in his office working through a site inspection report when there was a knock at the open door, and he looked up and Harold was standing there in his work clothes with his hands in his jacket pockets, a tall, thin man in his late 50s with the careful eyes of someone who does precise work and has learned to look at things closely before touching them. Mr. Calder, Harold said. Harold! Rafe gestured at the chair across from the desk. Sit down. Harold sat, which was something Rafe suspected Harold didn't do often in other people's offices, and looked around the room with the methodical curiosity of a person cataloging a new space. Nice office, he said. It'll do. Rafe set the report down. What's on your mind? Harold was quiet for a moment. He had the particular quality of a person who doesn't speak before they're ready and doesn't apologize for the pause. The Voss woman came to see me, he said, a few weeks back. I heard. She read the log. All of it, Rafe said. Harold looked at him with something that might have been surprise underneath its surface. All 47 pages. She told me herself. Harold absorbed that. Huh. He looked at his hands, which had the permanent specific staining of someone who works with mechanical systems for a living. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to help train the new maintenance team they're bringing in for the Meridian upgrade. What'd you say? Said I'd think about it. He looked up. What do you think? Rafe considered it honestly instead of reflexively. I think you know the Meridian systems better than anyone who's going to walk in off the street, and I think the people who don't know them are going to make mistakes that you could prevent. And I think you know that already, or you wouldn't be in my office asking. Harold looked at him for a moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not a smile exactly, more the particular expression of a person who has received an accurate assessment and has decided to accept it. Yeah, he said. That's about right. Then do it, Rafe said, and keep the log. Wasn't planning to stop, Harold said. I know. I'm saying keep it the same way you've always kept it. Don't change it because there's now someone above you who reads it. Keep it for yourself, the way it was. Harold looked at him. Why? Because the reason it was good was that it was honest, Rafe said. The reason it was honest was that you weren't writing it for anyone. The moment you start writing it for an audience, it becomes something different. Harold was quiet for a long moment. Outside the office window, the March sky was doing something complicated with clouds and light, shifting between gray and something that wasn't quite gray, a kind of undecided brightness that sometimes preceded real spring and sometimes didn't. You know, Harold said finally, most people in management don't actually understand what we do, down at the operational level. They understand the output, the building works, the heat comes on, The systems pass inspection. They don't understand the 50 things that happened between the last inspection and this one to make that true. I know, Rafe said. You always knew, Harold said. It wasn't a compliment delivered warmly. It was a fact stated flatly, the way Harold stated most things, which somehow made it land harder than warmth would have. That's why it was different working for you. Rafe looked at the man across the desk from him and thought about 11 years, and about what it means to do honest work inside institutions that are imperfectly built to receive it, and about the specific stubbornness required to keep doing it well anyway, not because the institution deserves it, but because the work itself does. Harold had that stubbornness. Delia had it. Sandra had it. They'd maintained it through years of working inside a system that wasn't looking, and the fact that someone was now looking didn't change the foundation of what they'd built. It just finally gave that foundation somewhere to bear weight. Go train the new team, Rafe said. Keep the log. And if you hit something that needs authorization, come to me first. Harold stood up. He put his hands back in his jacket pockets. You going to be here a while? He said. Not meaning the office. Meaning the company. Rafe thought about it honestly. I don't know, he said. As long as it's worth being here. Harold nodded once, which was the Harold equivalent of a full endorsement. Then he left. 6 weeks after Rafe's first day back, the Aldenmore Group sent an all-staff communication that was different from the ones that had come before. Patricia Howell had written 3 drafts, and Mara had sent back the first 2 with notes that said, in different ways, be more honest. The 3rd draft was the one that went out. It didn't use the language of corporate accountability, which is a dialect designed to acknowledge wrongdoing while distributing responsibility. So thinly that no individual weight is felt anywhere. It used ordinary language. It said that the company had failed its operational employees in specific and documented ways. It said that systems had been designed, intentionally or not, to prevent ground-level information from reaching people with the authority to act on it. It said that this had changed and described concretely how the reporting frameworks, the independent safety authority, the escalation channels that now existed and were real. It did not mention Rafe by name, which was something he'd asked for when Sylvia had given him the chance to review it in advance. He didn't want to be the story. He'd never wanted to be the story. What had happened to him was real and mattered, but the point of it wasn't him. The point of it was the 19 people who'd been working inside a broken system and deserved to have someone finally tell them that the system knew it was broken and was trying to be different. The response from staff was not uniformly positive, because real institutional change never produces uniform positivity. Some people were relieved. Some were skeptical in the healthy way that people are skeptical when they've watched promises made and not kept before. A few were openly cynical in ways that Rafe thought were probably earned and needed to be answered not with reassurance but with time and evidence. He read all the responses that came through the new feedback channel. Another thing he'd insisted on, an actual channel with an actual person reviewing submissions, not a suggestion box that emptied into a server no one checked. He read them himself, everyone, which took 2 hours on the day they came in and was one of the better 2 hours he'd spent since coming back. One of them was anonymous and said only, I sent 4 emails in 2021 about the loading dock situation. Nobody answered. Is that going to be different now? He pulled the loading dock file that afternoon. There were 4 emails, exactly as stated, flagged and unanswered. He contacted the person who'd sent them. He could identify them through the timestamp matching and asked to meet. They sat in his office on a Wednesday morning and he listened to the situation start to finish, and then they worked through it together, and by the end of the meeting there was a work order and a timeline and a budget line with his signature on the authorization. It was not a dramatic meeting. Nobody cried. Nobody made speeches. It was a person who had been ignored finally being heard, and the practical outcome was a loading dock that was going to get fixed 6 months earlier than it would have otherwise. That was what it actually looked like. Not the cardboard box moment, not the conference room confrontation, not the dramatic resignation that the 34th floor had witnessed on a Tuesday morning in February. The work was this: a loading dock, a parts log, a damage assessment submitted before the budget cycle would technically allow it, a conversation in someone's own office instead of a conference room, the 1,000 small acts of paying attention to what was actually happening and making sure it reached the people who could do something about it, and making sure those people did something about it, and then following up to make sure the something that was done was actually the right thing. He understood now, in a way he hadn't fully articulated before, that this was what he'd always been doing. Even in the years when no one was listening, even when the memos went into the void, and Garrett's eyes stayed flat, and the ceilings fell in empty hallways, he had been doing exactly this work, and the fact that the institution had been failing to receive it didn't mean the work was wrong. It meant the institution was broken in a way that he alone couldn't fix from the position he'd been in. The difference now was the position, not the title. Titles were just words, and he'd known enough people with impressive titles to understand that they meant nothing unless the authority was real. The difference was the authority. The ability to say this is not safe and have it mean something. The ability to be the place where the Heralds and the Delias and the anonymous email senders could bring the things they knew and have those things become action. That was what he'd walked back into the building to do. Not to be vindicated, not to prove something to Mara Voss or the 34th floor or himself. To do the work with tools that actually fit the work, for the first time in 11 years. On the last Friday of April, he came home to find Camille on the front porch with a glass of wine and her face turned toward the evening sun, which was doing something genuinely good in the April sky, warm and low, and the particular gold that only shows up in spring when the light has to come through new leaves. He sat down next to her on the porch steps, and she handed him the other glass that had been sitting beside her, which meant she'd expected him at this time, which meant she knew him well enough after 20 years that his habits were readable to her without discussion. "Good week?" she said. "Complicated week," he said, "but productive." She nodded. They sat for a while in the quiet of the street, the sound of the neighborhood, in early evening. A lawnmower 2 houses down, kids on bikes, the specific layered ambient sound of a place where people are going about their ordinary lives in proximity to each other. "She called you today," Camille said. "Mara." He looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because you came home with that specific expression you have when a conversation was hard, but you think it went the right way." He shook his head slightly. 20 years. "She wants to expand the role," he said. "Add 2 more facilities to my oversight, which means I need to hire. And I think Delia should move up, take on a deputy role, which means I need to backfill her position. Which means you need to find another Delia. Which means I need to find someone who doesn't need to be another Delia," he said. "They need to be themselves. Someone who keeps their own log for their own reasons and doesn't need to be recognized to keep doing it right." Camille was quiet for a moment. "How do you find someone like that?" "You pay attention," he said. "You look for the person who does the job well when nobody's watching. They're usually not hard to find once you know what you're looking for." She looked at him sideways. "You know most managers don't think that way." "I know." "Do you think she does, Mara?" He considered it, the honest version. "I think she's learning to," he said. "I think she came from a world where you measured what was measurable and managed what was visible and trusted the chain to surface what mattered. And I think she found out the hard way that the chain doesn't do that it filters instead of surfaces, and that the cost of that gap shows up eventually regardless of whether anyone wanted to look at it. And now? Now she reads Harold's log." He paused. "Not because I told her to. She asked for it herself last month. The updated version." Camille was quiet for a moment, then, "That's something." "Yeah," he said, "it is." They sat on the porch steps while the evening came down around them, and the light in the maple tree at the corner of the yard was green and gold and moving slightly in the warm April air, and the lawnmower 2 houses down finished its work and went quiet, and the kids on bikes turned and headed back toward their houses as the streetlights began to think about coming on. He thought about a Tuesday morning in February and a conference room with thick carpet and floor-to-ceiling windows and a cardboard box folded flat under a table that nobody had gotten around to throwing away. He thought about picking it up, the specific moment of reaching down and picking it up, not because he had a plan or because he knew what came next, but because some things have a threshold and he had finally reached his, and whatever waited on the other side of it was going to have to be dealt with as it came. He thought about what had come. The fear in the parking garage with shaking hands, the calls he hadn't made and the conversations he'd needed a few days to find words for. The morning walks through the frost-dead neighborhood, the resume that felt thin, the uncertainty that had lived in his chest like a low-grade weight for 5 weeks, and had never fully gone away, even as the weeks filled back in with work and purpose and the ordinary demands of a life in motion. He thought about what was still imperfect. Terrence Webb, who was in his transitional role in doing acceptable work and who would probably never fully reckon with what he'd chosen not to do when it mattered. The loading dock emails that should have been answered in 2021. The budget negotiations that still sometimes produce compromises he didn't love. The institutional friction that didn't disappear just because the institution was trying to be different. Mara Voss, who was learning, but who had spent 22 years building habits of mind that didn't restructure themselves overnight, and who would probably fail again in some future version of this same situation before she failed less, the way all real change works. None of that had a clean resolution. None of it was going to have one. The point wasn't the resolution. The point was the direction. There's something that people don't tell you about standing up inside a broken institution, something that the dramatic version of the story, the cardboard box, the silent conference room, the moment of principle, doesn't quite capture. They don't tell you that it's not a moment, it's a practice. The standing up is not a single act that changes everything. It's a decision you have to keep making, in smaller ways across the ordinary days that follow the dramatic one. The emails you have to write and actually send. The conversations you have to go looking for instead of waiting to have. The work orders and the budget authorizations and the loading docs and the parts logs. It is not glamorous work. It never was. But it is the work that holds things together for the people who need the things held together, and someone has to do it, and the only question worth asking is whether you're willing to be the person who does. He'd decided he was. He'd decided that in a conference room on a Tuesday morning in February, though he hadn't fully understood what he was deciding. The cardboard box had just been the way the decision announced itself. He finished the wine. The streetlights had come on now, soft and orange against the blue evening, and Camille leaned slightly into him the way she did when she didn't want to say anything, but wanted him to know she was there. He leaned back. The porch was nothing special. The street was ordinary. The evening smelled like cut grass and new leaves and the particular warm soil scent of a spring that was finally, after a long winter, actually arriving. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was what